3 p.m. and I think that we are all set to begin. And
Good.
I think that we don't have to wait for anyone. I've also pressed the recording button. So first of all, I would be introducing Professor Dr. Suman Gupta, and then we would request him to give his talk, which will be followed by a question and answer session. And scholars at the back, they can come to the front row to put a question directly, or they may also send their question in writing to me, and then I'll put the question to Dr. Gupta. Now, first of all, we are really very thankful and honored that Professor Dr. Suman Gupta is here with us. I would like to mention that he has received his education at universities of Delhi and University of Oxford, and now he's associated as a professor, and he chairs Department of English and Cultural History at the Open University. He has been associated with these international projects, which are really wide-ranging. For instance, this project on globalization, identity politics, and social conflict, which was done in between 2002 and 6. He has worked as the joint director of the Ferguson Center of African and Asian Studies. He has also worked on, he has coordinated projects on contemporary Indian publishing, Indian English publishing, and he has also worked with on this project on Nigerian moving picture industry, on English studies in non-Anglophone context, East Europe 2007 to 2010. Also, he has worked on this project with Professor Richard Allen, Prospects for English Studies, India and Britain Compared. And apart from that, there are, of course, lots of other projects. He has worked at universities in Beijing. He has worked at University of Cambridge as a fellow at University of Delhi. So I shared your profile with all the participants who are here with us. As far as his books are concerned, these are really very interesting. At the moment in Pakistan, English departments are diversifying. Our department has recently upgraded as Institute of English Studies. So it's really very interesting that Professor Gupta has recently, in 2020, his book has come out, which is entitled Social Analysis and the COVID-19 Crisis. So I would also take this opportunity to welcome Professor Dr. Amra Raza. She is a professor of English, and she's also the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Humanities. So I welcome Professor Dr. Amra Raza that she has joined us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And apart from that, these titles are indeed very interesting. For instance, his 2020 book on Digital India and the Poor Policy, Technology and Society. And most interestingly, this book with the title, What is Artificial Intelligence? Conversation between an AI engineer and a humanities researcher, which has also come out in 2020. So, and the list is quite long, and all of us have looked at this list, and it is indeed very impressive. So I hope that in the later Q&A section, I would definitely be asking Professor Gupta, what is the secret of this prolific scholarly activity and how he manages to write so much. And so that definitely would be a question I would ask later on. Now, with this, I would request Professor Dr. Suman Gupta to please give his initial talk, as we discussed earlier on AI and humanities. And then later on, we'll have lots of questions for him. So over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me. I'm very grateful. It is a terrific opportunity to meet you. I've relatively never been able to visit Pakistan, and I hope that will be rectified someday. But this is as good an opportunity as any. to interact with you. So I'm really very grateful for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to this session, have been looking forward to this session for the last few days. So I think we decided that we will talk about artificial intelligence of the range of topics you had suggested. And I will do so bearing in mind that we are all essentially humanities researchers, I think. So we are primarily interested in language and literature. And let me say what I'll not be doing. This isn't a particularly technical talk. So I'll not be trying to summarize how AI works or what the mechanisms and technologies are. And nor indeed am I equipped to do so very well. So I'll be considering AI in terms of indeed language literature. And I'll raise three indeed very large questions, which follow from the term. What is intelligence? What is artificial? And what does it mean to be human? Something that is absolutely central to the humanities. And I suppose we should start with some idea of what sort of preconceptions about the idea of artificial intelligence actually exists at present. If I'm still, you can hear me properly. You can, can't you? Yes. Okay, good. I suppose the broadest idea of artificial intelligence is that machines would be able to do what humans do. However, if we try to imagine this situation, and it's prolifically imagined in science fiction, for example, or in films, one usually has a somewhat anthropomorphic form of a machine, and we tend to think of the machine as replacing an individual human, an individual person. Now, that's not the view I'm going to take in the reflections I'll offer. I'll be thinking really in terms of concepts, and I'll be offering under those three large headings broad concepts. I'll be offering these in a fairly common sense fashion. And I'll be questioning really how we use language, ideas of the human to understand the concept of artificial intelligence. So don't forget everything about robots, synths. What does AI look like? AI doesn't look like anything. AI is essentially a concept and a system. That's the first point I wanted to make. And with that, we can move on to the idea of intelligence, obviously a particularly complicated idea. And let me start with a kind of term that we tend to use. When we talk about intelligence between ourselves, we are talking really of a term which we take for granted. You and I, we think that we know what this term means already. In a way, we are exemplifications of that term. We are intelligent and we know what we are. That's the kind of initial idea. Now, I'll call this idea that we have a very strong preconception of knowing already what intelligence is as being a particular kind of term. I'll call this a numinous term. A numinous term is something that seems to be self-evident, that seems to shine with its own light, as it were. And let me explain that a bit more. A numinous term tends to get defined in terms of a circle of terms. So if I asked you, what is intelligence? You might say it is the matter of being conscious. And if I asked you what is conscious, you'd probably say it's knowing and understanding. And if I asked you what's knowing and understanding, you'd probably come back and say that is intelligence. So essentially, these are terms which tend to define each other. Knowing, consciousness, sentience, understanding, intelligence. This is like a circle of terms, all of which are equally self-evident, which we use to define each other. And it's quite difficult to step outside that. It's quite difficult to say intelligence consists in ABC. We usually say intelligence consists in knowing, understanding, being conscious. And those are all terms which beg the definition. And once you ask for the definition, you sort of go in a circle. So a numinous term has this kind of quality of going in a circle. We have a set of numinous terms, we take them for granted, we use them all the time, they make sense to us. But if we begin to try to break them down, it's quite difficult. So that's where I mean, much of what I'm going to say derived from that conversation in that book, which Shazad mentioned. That's where we started from. How do you actually define intelligence, not so as to be able to say that you and I know what it is, but so as to be able to replicate it, so as to be able to use some kind of system or technique which does that thing which we call is intelligence. So this needs something more than a numinous term. It needs something more than simply saying knowing is intelligence or consciousness is intelligence and so on. We need to understand this in some way. So this is quite a challenging question in various ways. It's quite difficult to find a way. So let me give you an example of the kind of things we might consider to be intelligent. Let's say, and this is something I'm sure concerns at least your students, taking exams. You want to take exams and you want to get the best grade possible. So you have set your task. The task is passing the exam best grade possible. And you have some abilities. You have textbooks, you have some primary knowledge, your reading and writing is fluent and all the rest of that. So you have some functions. And you will use these functions, you'll read your textbooks, think about them, read and write about them, and then be prepared for the exam, which is your target, to do the best you can. So you have two things here. You have a set of functions, a set of equipment, some ground level sources, and you have the target. And the question is, how best to get from the source to the target? However we look at this, this is something that we can now do with a machine. So however you set that target, if you say, I want to win a chess game, that's a target of a similar sort. It's like passing an exam. Or I want to get from A to B. Or I want to plan a workshop. Now, all of these are target-based thinking. And targets, by and large, can now be replicated at a mechanical level. And the way in which that is done is thought of as machine learning. To have a system, a mechanical system, you can feed it the primary conditions, these many texts, this quality of reading, these kind of sources. You can tell it the target I want to get to. I want to win every chess game. I want to get the highest score in some kind of game. I want to pass the exam. I want to get to B. I want to plan a workshop, whatever you tell the target is. And you can set an algorithm. And this algorithm will be able to compute and create a policy. This policy is important, this idea that there is a relationship between your target, your source materials, and the policy. Moreover, and this is called reinforcement learning, you can set your machine to decide what is the best policy to get most successfully to that target. That's a big achievement. It's a huge achievement. It seems to take most of the things we think of as intelligent work that humans do as possibly mechanizable. You can use that almost anywhere. You can use that in planning your academic monograph. You can use that in financial investments. You can use it in sports. Big achievements that people have understood very clearly, winning chess games, for instance, or winning Go. So you can mechanically set a set of functions to reach a target by maximizing a policy. And this can be mechanically done. But is that intelligence? Now this is the nub of our issue. Is that intelligence? a lot of us seem to think that is, in fact, primarily what intelligence is: solving a problem, getting to the target. But I'm going to suggest that there is something else. And intelligence works in a slightly different way. Let's say winning a chess game or passing an exam. You and I could prepare and pass an exam, but that's not really in itself what the whole. The question we could ask is, why pass an exam? Or why win a chess game? And then you might say something like, well, because I want to be intelligent, because I want to be the best in the world, or because I want to bring world peace, or because I want to contribute to knowledge. And then we can keep asking why. We can say, well, why do that? And then ultimately you want to say, because I want to reach a pinnacle of human achievement. We can give many answers, because I want to fulfill human potential. The question is, asking the why takes us away from the target. The target is set because there is something larger behind it, because we have a why behind it. Now, it's incredibly difficult to describe this ultimate point because most of us define them in very different ways. Some of us might think that there is some kind of idealistic notion of human potential, that there is an ideal position that we are trying to reach to. We are trying to get to the bottom of knowledge, or we are trying to get to the best that we can be. Now, all these terms also, the best that we can be, to be fulfilled, to have potential, are also numinous terms. They're also extremely difficult to define, just as intelligence is. But we need those terms to be able to set ourselves tasks. In a way, and we can flip this argument around, we think of intelligence as achieving a task, but perhaps we should think of intelligence as being able to set targets. I hope that makes sense. And incidentally, I should have said that if anything doesn't make sense, you can interrupt me. It's much easier that way than trying to remember. But let me repeat that. We normally think of intelligence as a matter of setting a task that needs to be fulfilled. Insofar as we can set tasks and fulfill them, much of that, indeed almost all of that, can in principle be mechanized. But that is actually maybe only a limited version of what we do as intelligence. By and large, the more important part is being able to set the task. And the mechanics of how we set the task has not yet been fully worked. It comes under a broad idea of intentionality. And that's how an AI engineer would think about it. How do we actually come to intend? How do we intend to fulfill the task? That's much more important than simply setting a task. Now, in a way, setting a task, and even if it's quite a high-level task, is not very different. If you set a task to, say, a clock and say, tell us the time, to some extent, we have set the task, and therefore we have a tool which tells us the time. That might be quite a low-level kind of example, but it's not really significantly different from having a machine which wins a chess game. We have set it a target, it has accomplished it. So setting the target is the key. Fulfilling the target, getting from sources to target, from abilities and skills to target, can be mechanized. But setting the target is dependent on something larger. And this something larger is understandable as a matter of constantly asking why. If I asked Shahzeb, for instance, why did you do a PhD? In principle, perhaps if Shahzeb had a sufficiently complicated machine, he could have set it to say, well, do this PhD on English studies in Punjab University, and a great deal of the work could have been done mechanically. But the crucial thing about Shahzeb's PhD is that there's a larger vision behind it. If I asked him, why did you do a PhD? He might say, it's because I want to improve English studies in Pakistan, because I want to raise the level of Pakistan above, because I want to have human world knowledge. All these larger whys are necessary for the target to be set. So in a way, they are first, and the target is later. And much of intelligence works in that fashion. We have larger larger intentions. The question why is extremely important. That's the first part. So let's leave that there as an account, at least a working, quite simple account of what the word intelligence consists in. It is at any rate an account which is not numinous. I would like to point that out. We have given a set of relationships rather than say intelligence is just knowing or understanding. Intelligence is a way of posing answers. I've lost you. Okay, I lost you for a tiny bit. Are you still there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can listen.
Moving on. Yeah, okay, good. So the next part, the question of artificial. So there are these two words, artificial intelligence. Let's say that's a reasonable account for us to work with, the concept of intelligence. Artificial poses similarly difficult questions. It is actually quite difficult in nature to tell what is artificial. And this is just a plain fact. If you took a picture from outer space of the Earth, you would find it quite difficult to discern what part of what you see is artificial and what part is, let's say, natural. And we usually have some rules of thumb. Rules of thumb is what we live with. We would say that if there is a blueprint, that's artificial. So if there is a plan or a design which seems to be regular, for example, in nature, it is very unusual for extremely straight lines to appear. So if we saw an extremely straight line happening somewhere, if we saw a pond, for example, that was absolutely a perfect square, you would tend to think that is artificial, not natural. Nature seems to exist with some degrees of irregularity. But that's a rule of thumb. There is no reason. There are, in fact, natural phenomena which produce extreme degrees of regularity. Similarly, we might think that there should be some mark of artifice. So if I look at a table, I can see that it has been sawed here and chiseled there. And these marks, there's always a mark of some kind of work having been done that shows that this is artificial. These are very common ideas, rules of thumb that we work with. But there are, when it comes to making something that is as complex as a human being, then we are looking at a certain challenge. And there are various ways of approaching this question. The most common one, there's the Thesis Paradox. I'm not sure whether you know, you must have heard of the Thesis Paradox. It's essentially, suppose there's a ship and you start replacing bits of the ship. You replace one plank which is broken with another plank, then you replace the forecastle, then you replace the sails. At what point can you say that you have actually replaced the whole ship and now you have a new ship? That kind of paradox plays a particular part. Now, let's say that I take a human being, I take a person, and I begin to replace each part. I replace the arms with a mechanical thing, I replace the head with a mechanical thing, the eyes, every organ. At the end of it, I'll have replaced the human being with a machine. But is this really artificial? Is the act of replacing artifice in itself? Well, that's one concept of artificial. That's one place where we can start. We can start thinking of replacing each and every bit of the total being. But that does leave one important point out. We can do that, and the end result might work just like a human being, but we wouldn't know at what point it became intelligent. Yeah. So simply by replacing, we don't understand how intelligence has come about. But we would have created possibly an artificially intelligent system purely by replacing. That's one concept of intelligence. Let's call that a physical concept. You're taking the physical thing, you're replacing it bit by bit, you're reproducing something similar in another material, and you think of that as artificial intelligence. That's one concept. The other concept would be to emulate behavior. The only reason I know, you know, and think I know that you and I are both intelligent is because we observe ourselves. So I'm looking at you, and from your behavior, your mode of communication, your interaction, I can make a judgment and say that you are intelligent. So it's a behavioristic response. And that's been at the basis. I mean, that is the basis of Turing's question. There is this famous Turing's test, which involves being not able to discern the machine is a machine in a communicative act. So in a way, behaviorism, being able to emulate what we think of as intelligent behavior, could be another way. If an artificial thing can emulate an idea of how we behave as intelligent beings, then we can think of that as intelligent. So now we have two slightly different concepts of artificial. The first is replacement. We take the vessel, mortal coil, the vessel itself, we start changing it, and somehow that turns into a mechanical intelligent thing, system. Or we start emulating the behavior of intelligence, and eventually that becomes indistinguishable from, and therefore per se, intelligent. We can take a third concept. We know that we have evolved. Intelligence is an evolved capacity. So there are different phases of evolution, and at some phase, intelligence has come about. If we think of that as a given fact, then we can call that a generative idea of intelligence. If we throw all the ingredients together, somehow intelligence will emerge. So it's a process. It's not just a matter of replacement. It's not just a matter of simulation. It's a matter of setting up a process whereby at some point intelligence will more or less automatically emerge. Let's call that a generative concept of artificial. So we have got three distinct concepts now. We have got the physical concept, replacement. We have got the behavioral concept, simulation. We have got the generative concept. We set up a process which follows a logical path. All of these, however, are missing out still on that central thing. We might make intelligence happen in a mechanistic system in the way we understood intelligence, that is setting tasks, having a purpose, having an intention. We might make that happen, but we are not sure how that's come to happen. And ultimately, we really like to know why our tools work. I mean, we do. I mean, if we have a computer, we need to know why it works. Otherwise, we can't repair it, for example, and we can't really use it very efficiently. So we need to know. So we need to have a relationship between the thing that we are trying to achieve and the mood in which it is achieved. And neither of these three ideas of artificial actually lead up there. They don't give us a sense. It happens, but we don't know why it quite happened. So then there's the fourth idea. We start with the concept. If we have a clear idea of the concept, then we use the concept to try to make it functional. Then we are approaching intelligence, or the idea of artificial intelligence, in a more robust fashion, in a way that is not accidental, not fortuitous, not just somehow there, but in a controlled and understood, rational way. And by and large, the question that an engineer would consider most seriously would be this idea that we need to have a strong sense of concepts which we have been able to execute and give flesh in a technology. Concepts is where you begin from. So let's park that idea there. Two things. There's an account of intelligence and there's an account of artificial. Now, if one looks at these two accounts and then looks at the technologies that we have available now, even technologies which are very straightforwardly labeled as artificial intelligence, actually very few of them qualify. Almost none of them can in these terms, not almost, none of them, period, can in these terms be considered intelligent. They can fulfill tasks, they can't set tasks. We set the tasks. They can't intend. We don't have a technology which can set up intentionality. We don't even have a technology which can actually offer explanative arguments, give explanations. And that's very important. The question of asking why, persistently asking why did you pass that exam? Why do you play chess? Why do you want that job? Everything has a horizon which makes sense of it. And intentionality is located in that region. That's not something that machines can do yet. Or maybe can ever do. We don't have a sufficient concept of it to be able to turn it into an artificial system yet. So to be honest, strictly speaking, much passes as artificial intelligence is not actually that. It is a label. And it's a label which is aspirational because in fact, what it has achieved is tremendous. The fact that you can win chess games, you can prepare for an exam, you can get almost anything accomplished, you can set up a system, you can do a tax return, you can do almost anything mechanically insofar as there's a target, is an enormous achievement. And we like to think that that is very close to being intelligent, but we are still setting the targets. And we don't yet have a way of mechanizing, in terms of the four concepts of artificial that I offered, a notion of how to realize intentionality or explanatory power. So we can pause on this idea of artificial intelligence, say, good, we know that artificial intelligence is a nice word. It does refer to some extremely important developments, but it doesn't necessarily refer to what it seems to be referring to. And behind that, you can say, along with the aspiration, there's another thing. There's also hype. There's a market. Artificial intelligence is essentially a promotional term. And here I speak only for myself. This is not really a view held very widely, but I think artificial intelligence is to a very great degree a promotional term, apart from showing the aspiration, and the aspiration is indeed great. It also shows a system of power. The system of power it shows is of a particular kind. It is trying to sell you something as if you have a companion. Smart systems, we are living in the midst of smart systems. We have smart apps, we have smart everything, really. So we are being given the sense that we are close to having a kind of companion living with us and what we are buying into. Or alternatively, we are being given a threat. We are being told that if you aren't compliant at work, you will be replaced by something that's almost as good as you, artificial intelligence. It makes you as a workforce more manageable. Even teachers, usually in the 90s and 2000s, it used to be considered that teaching is a relatively safe profession because you can't replace teachers. They, after all, have to do things which are really quite intelligent. But now you can replace quite a lot of teaching by mechanical systems. You can record, you can set objective type questions, a great deal of assessment can be done mechanically. You can process information and set it out, dispose it in an understandable way. A lot of that is mechanical. Insofar as fulfilling the tasks of teaching go, let's say 80% of what Suman Gupta does can be mechanized. And that gives my employers an opportunity to say, Suman, 80% of you we can replace. So why are we paying you this salary? Why don't we just pay you 20% of the salary you get? And Suman will say, but it's still, no, Suman replaced with 20% of the salary. And then I'll say, then what will I do? And in a way, that is the question. It's also a threat. They'll say, Suman, you have to do more things. You have to do more things to justify your salary. We'll make you work harder. We'll make you do even more teaching. We'll make you be nice. We'll make you behave in a proper way. Otherwise, we'll replace 80% of you. So in a way, it's a threat. It's many things. It's an aspiration. It is a mode of selling. It's an industrial propaganda thing. It's like advertising. This is what you will buy. You buy something smart. It's also a threat. It'll make you more manageable. And in various ways, the social grounding of artificial intelligence is a matter of language. It is a technology, but it's much more than that. It's part of our discursive apparatus, and it's used within power structures and everyday communication to manage us, to make us think in particular ways, ultimately to make us think that we are replaceable. That's where that final question comes up. So what does it mean to be human? Let me take a very narrow, inadequate point here. Let's say that to be human, and that is a very management point of view, production, let's take the idea of production in a very wide sense. Everything we do is production. If we write a novel, that's the production. If we do art, we are producing something. But similarly, if we teach, we are producing something, and so on. So the sum total of everything we do is production. Let's call that P. And let's say that all the things we do are human. So let's start with the idea that human is defined by the sum total of the things we do produce. Now we start putting the system in there. As we observed with the definition of intelligence, much of what we do is based on tasks set for us. So while it is true that Suman Gupta teaches because he likes teaching, it is also true that much of what Suman Gupta does by way of teaching is actually not decided by him. It is decided by the university, by the ministry, by lots of other people. So while I'm investing my interest in there, I'm also complying with the many things. In other words, I'm fulfilling tasks. The reason why the university can tell Suman Gupta that 80% of you can be replaced is because that 80% is task fulfillment, which I have not set myself, which has been set for me by society, by the community I live in, by my family, by the ministry, by the power, and so on, whatever it is. So a great part of my existence is actually fulfilling tasks which I have not intended. I can make them fit my intentions, and we always do. So I try very hard to teach clearly. I hope my students understand what I say, because that's an intention. I want my students to understand. And I think that I'm contributing, and our students will contribute to knowledge and so on and so forth forever after. So I can make the tasks fit my intentions, but nevertheless, the tasks also have an autonomous kind of existence outside me, and they can be replaced. You can put a machine there to record a bit of Suman Gupta to replace the kind of knowledge is. So that whole thing of production, P, can now be chipped away at. Let's say there is N, the bit of P that can be mechanized. And I would suggest that every time we have an N which replaces a bit of human production, the human being becomes smaller. It becomes P minus N. So if we start from the idea that human is equal to everything we produce, then we start taking a bit of production N and say pass it on to a machine. The human has become a bit smaller. It has become P minus N. And one way of thinking about artificial intelligence is to say that that N is growing and the P is becoming smaller. I hope that that sounds logically sensible. Um, okay, sorry, you went out for a bit. So where is the boundary? Suppose N becomes P. Suppose that the sum total of everything we produce can be totally mechanized. Then what is left of the human? And this is a very serious question. In fact, this is directly a policy question, because our whole social arrangement is dependent upon a concept of employment paid for it. There's an exchange. And if the P becomes smaller, if the human quotient of production becomes smaller, and the mechanical quotient becomes larger, then we could reach a critical point where we don't know what to do with the human. Now, we have already had this, of course. There was an industrial revolution, and one divided things up. One said, right, we can do quite a lot mechanically, but we can't do quite a lot mechanically, and that's the human. We'll focus all human production in the things that we can't do mechanically. But then we keep chipping away at it. We keep making, and that's where we are now, the things that we used to consider in the 1960s as being a purely human mode of production are becoming mechanized. And the space of human production is becoming smaller and smaller, so that Suman Gupta has to wonder whether 80% of him can't really be replaced very soon. And this is a policy issue. Now let's stand back a bit. One of the things we need to consider is that this whole idea of mechanization, automatization is for the human. So it is for us to exist and fulfill ourselves that this thing is supposed to happen. It is not for us to get minimized. It's not for us to become unemployed. The whole idea of mechanization is to help us, not to grind us down. So we seem to be caught up in some kind of strange contradiction, paradox. We are producing and fulfilling our human ability to make machines such that humans are becoming smaller and smaller. At this point, we can say that how do we deal with this? There are several options. One is let's carry on. Let's carry on. But then there we have a problem, because let's carry on means that eventually, just in terms of one parameter, employment, we'll be in big trouble. A great many people will be unemployed. A very small number of technicians will continue to be employed. Inequalities will increase, disparities will increase, poverty will increase, concentration of wealth will go, we'll be in deep trouble. But that's the way in which we are going at present. At present, there are so many interests behind going on as we are, that we are headed that way. Basically, let's carry on and not think about the consequences. The second way, and this also is there on the horizon, and now we are really talking about policies, is to say that ultimately it is for us that machines exist. Let's use those machines to free ourselves. Now, this is quite an old concept. So let's change the system, in other words. Whereas now we have an agreement that we work, produce, and get paid. Machines will keep producing, and we'll just get paid. We don't have to work any longer. We don't have to have this relationship between work and pay. If there is sufficient stuff in the world, then we can just distribute it evenly so that we can all have happier and freer lives. This is quite an old concept. I mean, this is where automatization actually came from. In general, this has been a concept which has been particularly strongly held by socialists, for example, that we can redistribute and we don't have to labor. Labor doesn't have to be proportional. If we can produce enough, we can redistribute and have freer lives. So that's another concept, and it's not gone. And if we have debates, and I'm sure you know of these debates about a universal basic income, that eventually the government will have so much surplus production mechanically done that the government will be in a position to simply distribute equitably. Everyone could get a salary and then do things not because they are forced to, not because they have a task set for them, but as they intend. And for instance, Herbert Marcuse thought that you can have an aesthetic ethos. We can all eventually, in the fullness of time, devote ourselves to doing things like writing poetry and painting and fulfilling ourselves in aesthetic ways rather than in an instrumental way. Policy could be directed towards that. Third, so that's the kind of compensatory idea. So machines produce and they produce so much that we can compensate. But this wouldn't happen unless there's a policy designing it. At present, the policy is the first one. Let's just carry on, inequality grows and so on. There are other policies possible. It is possible, for instance, to stop, to say that now we have an optimal position of production, mechanical. Let's just go for status quo. Let's just keep people employed. Let's just keep mechanization limited. And let's just go for status quo. Now, that's an even older one, really. That's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Luddites would want their machines to stop. We don't need to mechanize beyond a point. In general, this is considered to be backward looking, because obviously one of those numinous terms, one of those intentions is that human abilities will be stretched and developed sort of in concert. But anyway, that's a policy position. So these are several policy positions. And that's, I think, where we are as far as policies go. We have an idea of intelligence, but we have a great deal of publicity, which is passing off something that's not intelligence as intelligence. We have artificial abilities, but these artificial abilities are more complex than we think they are. There are social consequences, and the social consequences break down into several kinds of policies, but at present we don't really have a policy. We are just grinding ahead, more or less in short term, in terms of short-term goals. Yeah, I hope that made sense. I'd be delighted to have questions on any of these issues or indeed any other issues, and thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. अगर इसको वो ऑफ करने में इधर सी ऑन उसका माइक भी म्यूट कर दें करें आप So thank you very much, Dr. Suman Gupta, and it was such an amazing and enlightening talk, and the way you've problematized this terminology, that the word, and of course that's your signature style. Whenever I read your writing, the words that we take for granted, the way you deconstruct those words and explain hidden dimensions of those words, and I think that's simply amazing. So I would hold back my questions, and I would request, we have with us Dr. Amna Umar, and she is considering digital humanities these days, and she has also been planning to set up a Center for Research in Digital Humanities. So I would request, and she also has a few questions for you. And initially, it was Dr. Amna Umar who suggested this for you, that probably you may talk about artificial intelligence and humanity. So Dr. Amna Umar, please.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Yes.
So I had these two questions in my mind when I was just sifting through your work as well. The first thing was, you mentioned in one of your writings about the reduction of the human, and you've just mentioned it as well, and the shrinking of a teacher. I found these terms to be very interesting. If that is the case, then why do humanities teachers find artificial intelligence to be the savior of critical humanities in these days?
Yes.
Can you reflect on that?
Yes, it is an interesting question because you're absolutely right. Working in the Open University is very.
Correct.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Was it cut off? Yeah.
We actually shift cameras, so
Okay.
we shift cameras to adjust. So
Okay.
you may
So,
not.
okay. It is true that there has been a great deal of, let's say, almost a kind of missionary zeal about digitalizing teaching and academia. And to some extent, I think that was simply intellectual excitement, that this is something new. So it is something that can be done. And there are a great many of my colleagues who feel thrilled at the idea that there is this new tool, that there is this new way of delivering. And the very fact that you and I can sit, you in Lahore and I in London, is such an extraordinary thing. And this is quite exciting. So I think excitement, intellectual excitement, can't be underplayed. At the same time, there is also management and propaganda. The tools that we are using are not public tools. These are really Microsoft, Zoom, a few small tools used by a few very large companies. And they have a profit. The fact that you and I are sitting where we are and doing this is that we are using their tool. And that tool is bringing them profits. And they want those profits. So it is absolutely in their interests to promote the convenience of the tool so that you and I buy into this excitement. So that's another dimension of it. We are being constantly encouraged to be upbeat about it, even if it seems detrimental to our interests. And maybe we don't want to see that it's detrimental to our interests. And maybe it isn't really detrimental to be, it's not as black and white as that. It is good for us, and at the same time, it poses certain dangers, and we need to think about it differently. So we don't want to stop using these tools. I really would like to be able to talk to you in Lahore. So we do need these tools. At the same time, we need to think about the consequences of the tools much more carefully than we are. So I think humanities is not quite there yet. And digital humanities, and I do hope you will go ahead and set up some kind of project or center, because it's very much needed. At present, the state of digital humanities is very largely about using tools. If you go through a digital humanities handbook, and there are many now, and most recently there was one in India, Digital Humanities in India, which I was looking at with great interest a few months back. You will find that actually a great deal is about the consequences of using tools. But that's not what we as humanities do. I mean, we don't really constantly talk about paper and footnotes, for example. Those are tools we have always used. So doing digital humanities is not really about just using tools. It's about looking at the social and human consequences of the tools and the concepts that go with it. And that is something that digital humanities has not quite cultivated, I think largely because university managements and large corporations have been pushing tools so emphatically that we are kind of caught up in them. So yes, I think you should absolutely set up a digital humanities discussion, research institution with the idea that you will be aware of the tools, but you will also conceptualize, as is needed, its effects on humanity and society. Yeah.
Thank you.
And did you say there was another question? I thought there were two.
Yes. There's another one. So, and it's related to this, that should we accept our reduced roles as humanities teachers and give way to technology in order to save this field of learning from becoming extinct in near future?
Yes,
Because already we hear a lot about this within the domain of critical humanities. We are in crisis. We have to save the
Indeed, we
field.
are in crisis. I think the answer to the crisis is not that we can save it in the sense that it's a fixed thing. So when you think, and we just, I think
We lost the voice.
have you come back?
We can't hear
Can you hear me?
We lost you for a while, but you are
Uh,
back now. Your voice.
Am I back now?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me carry on. Yeah. You can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I was saying, to go back. So yes, I was saying that humanities needs to extend itself, basically. Humanities can't save itself by being something that humanities can only continue to become more and more relevant. And becoming more and more relevant means that humanities has to expand. Humanities has to conceptualize technology, has to conceptualize the social policies in every way possible, whether that's by writing novels or by painting or by thinking about philology or by working on history. Humanities, there'll be no crisis if humanities expands. I think that's very short in what I want to say. And digital humanities, in a way, is a kind of good example of this. Why do we keep talking about tools, conceptualizing what it's doing to the human? To some degree, post-human concepts of the post-human are beginning to make themselves grounded them sufficiently. So I think humanities has some work to do. And that work is to actually make itself in which I think it is already. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Sorry,
it's more of a comment that I'd like to make. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
It's more of a comment that I'd like to make, and I'd like to begin with your differentiation between the natural and the artificial. You made a difference, classification between what constitutes the natural and the artificial. For me, I'd like to add to this because for me, the artificial is characterized by the finite and the natural is characterized by the infinite. So, for example, language, the LAD, the language acquisition device in our brains, usually we learn language, or the human learns language by taking a finite number of words and generating an infinite number of sentences and new combinations. So using this idea, I'd like to comment that as a teacher, I would feel that my role perhaps would not be reduced by the use of tools or by the use of AI, if and only if I would be able to generate something new in my students. So in that way, the AI would remain the tool and my students would be able to generate something new. And AI would then remain in its mediating role, or we could keep it in the mediating role.
Okay, may I ask you, so in your current position as dean, how much of your work involves generating something new, and how much of your work is actually doing more or less routine things?
If I qualify it in a percentage, it should be 50-50. That's the target I usually draw for myself.
Okay.
But otherwise, it's just reprocessing.
Yeah, so to a great extent, one could say that just as 80% of Suman Gupta can be replaced. So the question is a matter of degree. When you say this is a moving boundary, because what would have been considered doing something new is now seems less new and more conventional. You tend to become acclimatized into templates and routines, and we do them in a replicative fashion. So the new is a moving boundary, and the ability to generate something new is also a moving boundary. In terms of management, and you are a dean, so you know all about management, is for the new, because the new is a relatively intractable productive factor. Turn it into money. But if something could be replicated, you would be able to turn it into money. So management, and by and large, therefore, management also tends to increase the possibility of mechanization. I mean, I agree with you that being able to do something new, which I would call being able to intend or being able to explain new things, are some things that can't be mechanized, but our rules as workers, as employers, as employees are in them. The question that a policymaker should be worrying about is whether we should be replacing everything that can be mechanized, because replacing that means that we are only left to do something new, and that's quite a difficult thing to do. If someone asked me to say something new in every class,
So with this, we'll take a question from Umar Shahzad, who teaches at University of Chakwal. He's online. So Umar, can you please go ahead and put your question to Dr. Gupta?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for such an enlightening talk, Dr. Gupta. This is something that is far ahead in sense of like groundbreaking research or whatever we call it. Um, I would like to ask that what literature has to offer to artificial intelligence. Like, can we conceptualize some algorithmically driven subjectivity playing out in a work of literature or something like that? Like, does literature can it offer something tangible to the growth of artificial intelligence, or it will always be the other way around? That's what I would like to ask.
Yes, I think in fact that's a question that interests me greatly. I think it's the latter. The idea that literature is only something that can receive technology and put into technology is in a way the idea that we are using tools. Just to take an example, part of intelligence is, as was just pointed out, communication. A great so-called artificial intelligence engineers do is think about natural and try to create systems which can respond, interact in human communication. Human communication is a terrifically complex business, and a great depends upon environments. And a great deal of what we do by way of literature is both replicate environment, a novel, and a novel is essentially a communicative act, so is a poem. A communicative act which is bound by certain contextual agreements. And understanding, certain aesthetic criteria, certain values, let's say, which we have imbued. All these are system functions, and what we relationship between a set of values and a set of productions, texts of various sorts. This is a complex communicative mood. Does literature impinge upon everyday life? I think it does all the time. A great deal of the things we talk to each other about include on certain writings and situations. We reflect upon popular culture, everyday life, what films we are watching. These things are tightly enmeshed, and our communicative systems call upon the things we think of as creative or literary. It is if those things are systematically left out. But no engineer at present is in a very good position, because it is assumed that those things are extraneous to natural language processing. I think it calls for a it is up to literature scholars, literateurs, writers to enter conversation, even if it's a reluctant field, but to enter this conversation with the technocrats, the engineers, and see where their part is. Not assume that there is no part, but to get, it has to be a forum to enter a conversation. I think the possibilities are endless, really.
Thank you very much. And now I would, there are so many questions, Dr. Gupta. We have all these stages.
That's excellent. Excellent, good.
So these students would step forward and they will put their question to you.
Good.
So you may introduce yourself briefly, your name and your program.
I'm Rida Akhtar. I'm a student of MPhil in English, first semester.
Excellent.
So we've been actually reading your articles, and we've been trying to read your chapters to well acquaint ourselves with your work. So all our questions are usually about what you've written before, and obviously what you've communicated here, and to evaluate something. Yeah. So my question is, someone tweeted a few days ago that AI is incredibly dystopian, but I want to taste what might be the final cutting edge of humanities. So, borrowing from your own jargon, like you use the word of data nations, I wanted to ask, how do you see the responsibility of a literature student in this world that is getting immersed in this quote-unquote rhetoric of artificial intelligence?
Okay. I think the simplest answer is to question. Every time a proposition is put forward, sorry, you can hear me, can't you?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So yes, I think the simplest answer is the first point is to ask questions from the disciplinary perspective. Humanity questions is language. A great deal of engineering, technology, management. Do I have you back?
Yes, now we have you back.
Okay. Yes, I was going to say that the first thing that humanities can do, and this is what I do all the time, is to look closely at the language. Do not assume that if it is a legal report, if it is a technological report, if it is a market, that these are things you can't examine as if they're literary texts. And if you do examine them as literary texts, you will find that they're written with hidden assumptions and with kind of rhetorical tricks. Everything is a kind of rhetorical trick. So the thing to do as a humanities student is to be attentive to the language of business, the language of law, the language of technology. These are not transparent languages. They're given, they're used as if they are purely functional, neutral modes of speaking, but they're not. And that's something we learn very well as a literature student or as a language student. We examine texts closely to see what their assumptions are, what their underlying persuasive techniques are, what the rhetoric is. And we should use that skill to question everything that comes our way, whether that's a legal document, whether that's a news report, whether that's a policy document. So I think that's the kind of most directly useful thing we can do immediately. We can start questioning and not disengage, not feel that we have to only read poetry and plays. We read everything. Every text carries with it a structure of rhetorics, a mood of expression, and social assumptions, which we are trained to unpack. Yeah.
So Zoya? Zoya is our colleague. She's a lecturer here at the Institute, and she has a question for you.
Good.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So adding to what the discussion has already been about, and relating your idea with Margaret Atwood's definition of dystopia as well, where she says that we don't sometimes realize the ramifications of our declarations or pronouncements and where we are headed. So we're headed to a dystopian vision where we'll be reduced further and we'll be replaced by machine and so on and so forth. We've already talked about what responsibility do we have, etc. At the same time, I was, because of digital humanities and because of so many tools being available, and like you said, we can also diversify our work. I was using n-gram graphs earlier for research study, and so merging ideas between linguistics and literature, and sometimes these things are not possible, humanly possible, to carry out such an intense analysis without these tools and these softwares. For instance, the collocations, simple collocations, or n-gram graphs, etc. And now, since these tools are so readily available, so there's this whole field of diversifying and interdisciplinary work and avenues we could explore. So would you shed light on that? I mean, how it could be,
Yes, it is the opportunities, as I said, are actually extraordinarily wide, but the main fulcrum of the opportunity is that it saves time. So one of the areas in which computation is particularly useful in the humanities is in corpus analysis. So if you have a large linguistic corpus, you can have a corpus of everyday use that's been happening since the 1950s. You can analyze this corpus. It can be millions of words, but you can analyze its lexical and syntactical features by using a relatively straightforward computational analysis tool. And these have been developed very quickly. It's not that this couldn't be done before. It could be done, but it would be extremely labor intensive. So what would have taken us maybe 10 years, we can now do in an hour, for example. So the main factor that is happening in terms of tools is compression of time. We are setting the targets, we are making this time easier to manage, but we are also making it more robust. Humans make errors, machines seldom make errors unless you set it wrong. So there are these advantages, and these advantages allow us to do a great many more things at the same time than we would have been able to even 40 years back. There's nothing to gainsay there, and these have to be used. But these are used in a reflexive fashion. So they're used to be able to extend, as I was suggesting, the humanities. In a way, what you said was about extending humanities. There's through some artificial kind of institutional quarrel or suspicion of sorts, literature and linguistics tend to exist in different kind of sectors of the university. There's usually a linguistics department and a literature department, and they speak imperfectly to each other. They speak less to each other than they should, which is a very strange thing, given that they actually came out of the same place. I mean, they both came out of philology. And so there is this kind of mutual suspicion, which is very similar to the kind of mutual suspicion that a humanities person has with an engineer. They both assume that there is something that they can't talk about. Clearly, the tools that you're talking about has made it easier for literature scholars to turn their texts into corpuses and use corpus analysis tools, which is now increasingly happening, or at the least to turn out beautiful word clouds and put them on a PowerPoint, which we do all the time. So there are chances of integration, saving time, but at the bottom of all that, we do still need that intent. Why should we do all that? Why are we using these tools? What is integration serving? And these are questions I'm asking you. I'm not going to give you answers, but I'd like you to answer these questions. You can diversify, we can go faster. To what end? That brings us to the question of utopias and dystopias, which we can talk about or not. I think you already have some concepts in mind, but that is the key question. Why do it?
So I announce Moiza. She is also part of our MPhil. Moiza.
Excellent. Hello.
I wanted to ask a question about the artificial intelligence you were referring. We have studied your chapter of institutional histories of literary discipline, where you described about the institutionalization of English over the world. So I wanted to ask, isn't artificial intelligence a new ploy of neo-colonialism? Because it is also being institutionalized now.
Yes, I'm not sure, because I think the answer is yes and no. Let me explain that. Very convenient answer, yes and no. It depends on how you think about the production of the tools that we think of as artificial intelligence. So when we say artificial intelligence is a particular mood of speeding up technological doing, we are thinking really of someone who is managing that industry. This industry is very largely private. It is not a public industry. So we need to be careful there. It is not America or Europe is producing artificial intelligence. It is large global corporations who are mainly producing and marketing the tools that we think of as. So I think we need to sort of rethink our notion of international relations a bit. It's not West and East. It's not as simple. There are very large corporations which operate everywhere. India has a great many producers of technological hardware and software, Infosys and others, who are no different, really, just a matter of scale, from Microsoft. So the production mechanism is not West and East, and it would be a misconception to think it is. It is the case, of course, that the colonial experience has led to the West, if we call it that, as being a lot richer, and therefore of these global corporations being largely centered in the West. But that doesn't mean that money is flowing to the West because of them. In a way, they profit, and that's the private sector, as far as I can see, profiting at the expense of the public. The mechanics of doing that is not imposed. If we look at India, it is not that India has a mechanics that is being imposed from outside. India is implementing large digital systems. It is a governmental program. So in answer to your question, I'd like to ask you first, what do you mean by neo-imperial? Whose imperialism? it is not the imperialism of one geopolitical territory or another. Maybe it is the imperialism of a class, or maybe it is the imperialism of a new corporate global elite. But that is different from the old imperialism.
Dr. Gupta, since we have many questions, and I would request you, and our request is an earnest request that these questions, a few more questions will be asked. But since Dr. Amra Raza was here since early morning, and she has interviewed 2025 up to, I don't know, 30 candidates for positions of lectureship. So now she has to leave. So now she would say her thanks to you, and then later we'll go back to students' questions.
Okay, that's fine with me, and thank you very much for coming after this very difficult morning you've had.
Thank you. Dr. Gupta, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
All right. The first thing I would like to express my deep pleasure at this forum is that I feel like the midwife who has finally met the doctor with whom they have birthed the thesis of Dr. Shahzaid Khan. So thank you very much for always being there for him. And I was just the midwife. I think you were the inspiration. So I may have been the AI, and you might have been the 20% of the inspiration.
I feel that you're being too generous. You're being too generous. I didn't actually do anything. Shahzaid sent me a complete thesis.
You were very, very helpful.
That is after the fact, really.
Secondly, it's a great pleasure that you have taken out your time and that you have made time for our students over here. I'm sure they're enamored with your talk, and we are all enlightened. I thank you so much for talking to us today and taking out so much time. I'd just like to end by saying that despite all the comments on the AI dystopia, I am really an optimist, and I'm going to continue trying to forge a utopia and primarily just doing it by trying to generate new ideas amongst students. So thank you once again. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you, and I do hope we all keep in touch.
So do I. Thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure talking to you. I loved meeting you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all my students who it's greatly heartening to see here. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with this, I would also thank Professor Dr. Amra Raza for always being so encouraging and for supporting our efforts. And with this, we have Dr. Amir Sultan from International Islamic University. He's part of this gathering virtually from Islamabad. So Dr. Amir Sultan, you can now put your question to Dr. Gupta. His hand is raised for quite some time.
Yes, I can see his hand.
So probably he's away for a while. So with this, I would, Yasser has a question.
Thank you.
I think there's some technical problem.
We can't hear you properly, Dr. Amir Sultan. So probably when the connection gets better, you can simply intervene and ask a question. Right now, we cannot hear you properly. So with this, Yasser, he is also an MPhil student. Yasser, go ahead, particularly that getting to global south.
Thank you, Professor, for this.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, there's some interference. I can't really hear anyone.
Now we can hear. So with this, Yasser.
Okay, so we can say that AI is still in its infancy. but
Yeah.
30, 40 years from now, it might be in some form of developed form or maybe in some command. But I think that it is safe to say that the same capitalistic machinery in the West will be developing AI and then exporting it to the South. So,
Can you hear me? Sorry, there's
Is this Dr. Amis?
so,
JJ, please.
so what will Western developed AI do for the global South in general? So like if it is utopia, maybe utopia for the global North and dystopia for the global South at the same time in the same world.
Yes, I'd like to be a bit more optimistic. I'd like to say that it's possible that AI will develop further in the global South. It depends what the parameters of the global South are. I think there are very powerful possibilities that AI will develop very strongly, has developed very strongly in China, for example. Consider China to be in the West. I'm not sure. I think AI is developing very strongly in India, and there is a great deal of investment in it. So I think the parameters of where AI will develop are not as clear-cut as they might have seemed, even 20 or 30 years back. I don't think it is necessary that the center of this technology is necessarily in North America or in Europe. On the contrary. So capitalism, however, capitalism is not a Western concept any longer. I think certainly India is as capitalist as any country in the world. I think China has adopted enough kind of mechanics of capitalism to be playing in the global markets in a very significant way. So capitalism is really a global phenomenon. The erstwhile disparities that were introduced by colonialism, the balance of powers are shifting. So I wouldn't be as confident as you sound that 50 years from now, the picture will look as it looks now. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hello, sir. My name is Naila Iqbal.
Hello there.
My name is Naila Iqbal, and I'm from MPhil Semester 1.
Hello.
So, while going through your work, I came by this book named Culture of Economic Migration that you edited and you wrote an introduction to. And I got acquainted with migration studies, and that looked quite interesting to me. So, in a post-COVID world, although we are in pandemic right now, but in a post-COVID world, what do you think how do you think the dynamics of migration studies are going to change? Or what will be the next nexus for the migration studies?
Yes, I think we are beginning to see some of the changes already. The obvious thing is a great deal more controls. So migrations, there has been, and even now there are lots of open borders, for example. But one of the consequences of the pandemic, but this has a larger kind of political will, is that these borders are being increasingly policed ever and ever more closely. In this also, artificial intelligence plays its part. Electronic surveillance, the possibilities have increased enormously. So I think simply the surveillance mechanism has turned into a gigantic business. There are huge corporations which get much to profit by persuading governments that the borders need to be controlled very, very closely. Now, when I started working on migration, that was in the 90s, I was quite interested in a group in Oxford who were arguing for not having borders at all, for removing all political borders and making all movement free. In the 1990s, for instance, in 1992, by the Maastricht Treaty, the European Union was formed, which was a large transnational organization, one of the key points of it was the principle of free movement. And free movement was meant to liberalize labor markets to make things easier so that people can move and work. What's interesting, and this is again in the pandemic, it has shown that even within the transnational union of Europe, nation states can stop their borders. Germany can stop Austrians from traveling across that border. It has always been an open border. So one of the results is that borders are becoming more heavily policed, surveillanced, and managed. And that is itself a significant industry. More policing means more illegalization, in my view. The entire thing about policing is that it clears up the boundary of who is legal and who is not legal. And there is at the same time a global, I think, as much in South Asia as in Western Europe, kind of right-wing nationalist turn in politics. This right-wing nationalist turn in politics has meant that concepts of us and them, outsiders and insiders, are being constantly hardened. These two things gel together. So migration will create, if we take a dystopic view, and I think what we have now is actually a relatively dystopian picture, is creating large and disposable illegal populations. So the outlook from that point of view is not very good. But I think, again, that needs to be studied. That process needs to be studied in a very direct way. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, sir. It's really elaborate. Thank you so much.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
My name is Ajmer Ahmad. I am a student of Dr. Shazib, Dr. Amir, and the Dean, Dr. Amar.
Yes.
All of them left now. No, except for Shazib. No, they have not left now. So, sir, I have listened to you, and you defined two kinds of artificial intelligence. One is the promotional kind. Now you said the promotional kind of artificial intelligence is the one which we are pursuing now, and it will cost our jobs or it will cost employment. But the real artificial intelligence or the artificial intelligence you have defined is something which does not only performs a set target, but it also questions why. It is something which decides its own target. My question to you is, would this intelligence, if it is ever artificially achieved, not become a greater threat to humanity, because this can also be the definition of consciousness? And robots might ask, why serve humans? Why perform the target that the humans are delegating to us? And why not become new masters, since we can do this task better than humans?
Yeah. So I suppose the part of your question is, let's not do it. Let's let's be cautious about this. I'd be careful about that. I think part of the concept, offering the concept, is to say that we are nowhere near it. We are not even sure it can be done. Maybe it cannot be done. Maybe it is conceptually impossible. That's the limit of what artificial intelligence can achieve. Artificial intelligence can't set intentions, because intentions are, as I was suggesting, actually numinous themselves. You don't know what they are. They just are there as a kind of agreement. Limit and not a possibility. But having a limit always means that we have to look at it closely, not stop looking at it. So I don't think we have anything to be frightened about yet. Let's look at that limit as carefully as we can, would be my current view. Yeah.
Thank you.
And this might be the second last question, because after this I would request Dr. Amir if he has a question, and I may have one final question.
I'm
Sure.
I'm doing my MPhil from the Institute of English Studies. So my question is, as you have talked about it, how actually it is the policy, not AI, is somehow establishing the notion that humans or their major contributions are replaceable. So the question is, do you think that the narrative of AI resonates with the neoliberal ideology of focusing on subjects, not structures, personal responsibilities, not collective ones? And in your opinion, what can be the alternate model for that policy?
Yes, I think I had that sort of, because I lost you in the middle, sorry. So your question is, what is the alternative to the kind of neoliberalism you described, which is focuses on subjectivity and individuals? Is that roughly the question?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I tend to understand neoliberalism slightly differently. I think its focus on individuals and subjectivity is a consequence, not a cause. So the main thing about neoliberalism is really about using states and corporations to manage money in a particular way. So I tend to focus on the money. I think neoliberalism is primarily about financial inequality. And one way of managing that financial inequality is to pass on responsibilities to individuals and do a kind of body politics in the way Foucault describes it. So the main thing is really about how states, governments, and corporations use public money and pass it on to private or elite hands. I mean, that's my main interest. And I think neoliberalism is actually located at that relationship between governments and corporations. So I think if one is thinking of alternatives, one has to look at that first. Maybe one needs to redraw the boundaries of government responsibility, corporate production more clearly. They should be separate. They shouldn't overlap. One shouldn't use public money for private corporations to provide public services, or at least one should do so in a very regulated manner. So yes, my answer, I fear, is not going to be about subjectivity, but going to be about the economic assumptions. The distinction between public and private is what needs to be examined, and that has existed. I mean, we have had other models of states in which the responsibilities of the government has been very clearly distinguished from the responsibilities of business and commerce. Yeah. So again, I can carry on about this because this is a big question.
Is your question answered?
Second
Yes,
question.
yeah, go on. Yeah, go on.
Go ahead. If you
So it was that what can be the alternative model of that policy, which is actually establishing the fact that the human and their major contributions are replaceable. In your opinion, what can be that alternative model?
Well, to examine that assertion, I think to say that they're replaceable is a point of view, and one could argue that it's not. But that would mean looking very closely at the people and the processes which assert that they can. So in a way, that's a matter of establishing the conversation, not to accept it, but to engage with it. Yeah.
Arjun,
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
One final question from a student, and then Dr. Amir and myself.
Hello, sir.
Sure.
Thank
Hello
you so
there.
much. My name is Arejas, and I'm also the student of MPhil program. We see artificial intelligence in everyday sphere of life, as we have smart watches, mattresses, glasses, and even smart homes. So how do you think we as humans, and particularly this field of digital humanities or this field of humanities and literature, can offer some sort of resistance or counteraction to this non-human surge engulfing every aspect of human life, keeping the fact in mind that these non-human faculties are governed by particular human powers who have history of hegemony and oppression?
Okay. I think that one needs to do, there's a distinction. What are you resisting? Question I ask myself. Are you resisting the technology, or are you resisting the moods of ownership of that technology? Because these are somewhat different things. To not use the technology doesn't necessarily mean that the modes of ownership and power will change. So if you had thinking of politics of resistance, then the first question you need to ask is what is being resisted? And technology itself is not necessarily the point of resistance, though technology does need to be studied because it is possibly a mechanics through which power works. So technology is not in itself the problem. Technology is a tool. And the problem is ultimately on who owns the tools, what sort of money they have, how do they actually make things unequal, how do they exploit, how do they expropriate? Stop them doing that. That's a political struggle, and I don't think that has necessarily a direct pathway through artificial intelligence or the technology. That is a matter of identifying the agency. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Dr. Amir Aziz is my colleague, and he teaches American literature here, courses on American drama, American literature. He did his PhD from University of Leiden. So he has a question for you, Dr. Gupta.
Yeah, thank you very much for your brilliant talk. I have a brief question which is related to the politics. Because artificial intelligence can't be confined only to the realm of science. We are supposed to benefit from its dividends in the realm of politics as well. For example, current public intellectual Noah Harari, he also talks about algorithms knowing us more than we know ourselves. So we know that populism, future elections, future course of history will also somehow be defined, or rather prominently be defined by algorithms, by artificial intelligence. But we should also be cognizant of the fact that prior to the arrival of science, we were also being warned of the consequences of science and the repercussions shall it begin. We are the beneficiaries of science, but we are also the victims of science. We have seen wars, weapons, etc., creating havoc across the globe. My brief question is, what is the future of natural human stupidities that have actually created troubles across the globe after the arrival of artificial intelligence? Shall it be a programmed history that our posterior or future generations be living, or shall it be a kind of a similar history where we shall have errors, mistakes affecting lives of future generations? That's it.
Yes. Well, thanks for that. I tend to be a tiny bit skeptical when we say that human beings have turned more stupid than they were. When one looks back in history, I doubt there's ever been any period in which stupidities have been evidenced. The penchant for war and violence is ever a human factor. Every period of history has been extremely violent. So I suppose the question is that we have the ability now to scale up our worst qualities. We can do more damage by being stupid than we used to be able, but we are still equally stupid. I don't think that that's changed a whole lot. The question is, now that we have a greater ability to go wrong with devastating consequences, and we can see the devastating consequences. Climate change is a devastating consequence. What can we do about it now? It is maybe more necessary for us to stop being stupid than it used to be in the past. In the past, we could be as stupid as we wish and do relatively little harm. But now when we are stupid, we really do big harm. And that is a serious problem. I don't know how to answer that. I fear that we are human. And it is, say, even in a way, endemic, or maybe even a right to be stupid. Equally, I suppose one could say that one shouldn't just focus on the stupidities. One could also focus on the extreme intelligences or the extreme cleverness. The ability that makes stupidity magnified also magnifies intelligence, and maybe we can use that technology to manage the stupidities that we do. That is something that my friend, the one I wrote that book in conversation with, would argue strongly, that if climate change is to be addressed, it actually does need technology to address it. You can't address it by stopping the use of technology. On the contrary, You have to address it by using technology wisely, for example. If we are moving towards overpopulation of the Earth, which we absolutely are, again, technology will play a part in our managing that situation. So technology itself is not a manifestation of stupidity. Technology might help us manage our stupidity. The modern age is no particular monopoly of stupidity. And beyond that, I think we can just focus on setting what is wrong right, or trying to address what seems wrong. But I think, again, first and foremost, I think I'd ask, which I thought was the thrust of what I was saying, that maybe we should stop using the term artificial intelligence because it is misleading. It is not the case. We don't have intelligence, and it's certainly not artificial. We do have tools. Maybe we should use the word automation or mechanization. The very use of the word artificial intelligence is part of the problem. It makes us think we have something that we actually don't. Yeah. So again, I'm not sure to what extent I've answered your question. Those are kind of rambling reflections on your question.
Dr. Gupta, I have two questions. One, I would like to ask you, where do you think, or how do you think the state features in the equation of containing the possible detrimental impact of this mechanization, but which is being dubbed as artificial intelligence? And I'm also reminded of Professor Shoshana Zuboff's comment on it in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I gave a talk on the book in our university's library club last month. And she has also highlighted this fact that the state was somehow sidelined, and now wherever there is this talk about regulating these, she kind of insinuates and calls them digital tyrants at one point in her book. And she says that they systematically dispossess any opposition, any resistance which emerges, and they somehow they begin to trumpet this cause of democracy, and they dispossess any such offensive which is launched against them. So in this scenario, where do you see the state, particularly in the domain of academic dialogue, where the state is automatically considered to be somehow an agent of evil, at least even if it's not articulated, we feel that the state is considered to be one such organ, particularly in the Foucauldian discourse. So how do you see the character of state in this whole scenario? And can we directly say that the state, it's time for the states to step in on behalf of its people and protect their interests and take over, even if that is required to safeguard the interests of human beings?
Yes, that's a very pertinent question. And I do think that it is time for states to represent public interests and to protect public money in the public interest. So I think that quite strongly. I think that's the thrust of what I do argue and find in my research, that public monies are being circulated against public interests by states. So yes, is the short answer to your second question. I do think it's time for states to step up. Sorry, can you hear me still?
Yes. And finally, on a lighter note and on a more personal note, I would like to put the question that I hinted at the very beginning, when I said that how do you manage this scale of scholarly output, and what is your routine? When do you write? When do you read? And how much time do you give to your friends and family? So if you may, because of course we are also working in universities, and in particular working in Pakistan, managing family and also interacting with friends, and then also having this desire to create something which is meaningful and yet not being able to do it. And then our young MPhil scholars, they are also on that track now. So what would be your advice, and a bit about it at the end?
Yes, that's an extremely difficult question to answer. I'm not wholly convinced that I have been particularly unusually productive. I think I have produced as much as many of my co-workers have, colleagues have. But I think in general, my experience is that I don't feel I have worked necessarily very hard, but if one does do things persistently, they tend to get finished. And your thesis is an excellent example of that. If you stick with it, it gets done. And I'm sure that you will go on to another book, and if you stick with it, it'll get done. And the reason one sticks with something is because one is interested in it. It is something that you can't stop thinking about. I think you'll know that. Any of us who have an interest in research find that once we are beginning to investigate there's every reason for us to stick with things and it will get done. Too hard, actually. Yeah, have out with friends. Work will just happen.
We lost you in the middle,
Yeah.
but if you are still with us, I hope you are still with us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yes, I was saying it just happen. It just happens if you're interested in it. And the main thing is to actually have lots of fun and have outings with friends and go and cook up good food and have fine meals and not eat too much. Done.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Gupta. And since we can see you, so at the end, I would request the students to come forward, and we'd like to have a group photo with you. Of course, you are visible on screen, so it will be a memorable photo for us. So if you may kindly stay with us for a couple of minutes, we can have this picture taken.
Okay. That'll be good. Yes.
जरा एक पिक्चर तो लेते हैं आ जाओ उधर से लेंगे ना उधर थोड़ा पीछे से जाके आप इधर आ जाओ कैमरा तो उनको सामने उधर सामने और इधर आ जाए इस तरह
बेटा थोड़ा स्क्वीज हो जाना मेरे ख्याल में इस तरह तो आगे आ जाएगा बिल्कुल स्क्रीन के ना सो दैट वी हैव
ये ठीक है नहीं है अगर इधर आ जाओ इधर करीब आ जाओ ना नहीं आ रहे
आप खड़े हो जाओ खड़े हो जाओ मैंने उनको ठीक है
Take it. Please take a few more before we say final goodbye and thanks to Dr. Gupta. All right. So are we supposed to say cheese? Dr. Gupta's image is actually frozen on the screen. All right. Thank you very much,
you.
Dr. Gupta. Thank you so very much. It was indeed very enlightening. And what else can I say? It was indeed
It was
a memorable.
all my pleasure.
So thank you very much, and I hope that myself and our students, they will keep interacting with you through emails, and we love to continue to read your works. And especially today we had limited time, we had lots of questions regarding rereading Harry Potter as well, and there were so many other areas that we were unable to cover, but hopefully these conversations will go on. So
Yes,
thank
I'll
you
be
so
happy to
much.
stay in touch. Thank you very much. Bye then.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for it.
Thank you so much, sir.